Hello, I'm Grant James from Sea2Soil. I'm really excited to introduce a range of podcasts from experts all over the world in the industry, where I talk to them about soil biology, I talk to them about soil microbial activity, and I talk about increasing the soil health. Because at the end of the day, if we don't have healthy soil, we don't have healthy crops. Grant James here from Sea2Soil. I'm with Joel Williams on a podcast, a soil health educator. So Joel, soil conditioners, where do you see them fitting into the regen system and going forward?
You know, I think a lot of farmers have in recent times taken a really keen interest in their soils. There's been a real rediscovering, a reawakening of interest in this broad topic of kind of soil health. And sure, soil health is maybe a bit of a fuzzy word and depends on how we define that and a lot of context around that. But generally, of course, the idea is farmers are trying to improve that soil, some of the chemical, physical and biological properties. And soil amendments, such as carbon-based conditioners, that kind of thing, I think are really useful tools in that. I think every farmer knows that the value of soil organic matter and trying to boost that organic matter in the soils. So, some of those kind of conditioners and organic amendments and things are really useful at kind of stimulating soil biology, improving soil physical condition, these types of things. So I think as farmers become more interested in that broader topic of soil health, they're going to be interested in ways in which to improve that. And I think some of the amendments, particularly products and things from the ocean, like seaweed or fish-based products, fish hydrolysates, they contain a lot of valuable nutrients, but they also contain a lot of other carbon-based compounds, and those carbon-based compounds are great stimulants of biology and will help that biology kind of improve that soil health. And of course, in the context of fish, it's a protein-rich material. So, with things like fish hydrolysates, that breaks down into these valuable amino acids, and they're the building blocks of all life. So in terms of, say, the bacteria and the fungi and all those organisms in the soil, they need amino acids to build their bodies. So it's a great food source for them, but also for plants. Plants need amino acids as well to build their bodies. And so these types of inputs are really very applicable, be that if we're looking at below ground perspective in the soil and the life in the soil, or an above ground perspective with the plants up above.
Okay, and medium to long term, what should the farmers be gaining from doing this? Because this is not just a quick fix, it's something that's going to happen over time. So in your experience, how long is that time and what are the benefits they're going to get?
Yeah, that's a good question. Soils have taken time to degrade. It didn't happen overnight. It's been a gradual process of soil degradation, and equally it's going to take time to rebuild those soils and repair those soils. It definitely does not happen overnight. It is a multi-year process, and to be fair, it's a lifelong journey. I would say regenerating soils is something that is a process of continual improvement. But I would say, no doubt, there is some kind of a transition phase in this general 3 to 5 odd year mark. But again, it really depends on the different soil types, maybe the different starting points. So it really depends on where you're starting and some of those other kind of factors. So there's no set real answer to that. But ultimately, it is a few years transition. But even that aside, I think it's still a journey of continual improvement over time.
And from your worldwide travels, have you spotted any sort of situation where it gets to a limit and then you say, right, we won't be feeding the soil anymore, or we won't do, or we'll cut back? Does that ever happen? I've never seen that.
Some inputs can be helpful early on, and then the need for them maybe decreases over time. I think that there are some instances of that. But I think that maybe more broadly speaking, when we're talking about production, agriculture, we are talking about a lot of year after year crop removal or nutrient removal. And so, there may be an argument of some need to be somewhat replacing that to some extent. So I think that there's a bit of a balance there to be had in terms of offtake and inputs. But that's part of a bigger conversation around, that actually there's a lot of nutrients in soils already. Again, maybe depending on the soil type, more of the silt and clay kind of clay soils, they do have good nutrient reservoirs in them. They're there, but they're often just locked up and unavailable. And so the key to kind of unlocking those is through better biological activity. So again, various kind of carbon sources and amendments ameliorants which can feed and stimulate that soil biology, that is also going to help with the long-term sustainability in terms of cycling nutrients and therefore lowering the dependency and the need on some of those external inputs. So yes, I think there's some extent for that, but I think it's a little bit of both. There's most likely going to be some need for continual topping up and replacement, but certainly not as much as maybe initially.
And when do you feel the best time to put the amino acids on is? Is it a case of a split situation where you go on in the autumn and you go in the spring, or what's your feeling? I suppose it depends on the crop, doesn't it?
If you view them as the building blocks of all living things, you could argue that actually a continual supply would be quite good, would be just fine. Living things are always going to be needing them. So that could mean that, okay, maybe the window where you're not going to apply them is in the middle of winter when not much is growing and you're going to have everything pretty dormant. So no, I wouldn't bother then. But beyond that, if you've got actively growing soil, good enough soil temperatures for soil biology and or plants actively growing, then they're going to benefit from those amino acids. Now, that's a general answer. Now, but underneath that, we could get a little more specific and say, okay, if you look at the supply of inorganic forms of nitrogen versus organic forms of nitrogen, the inorganic forms typically encourage a lot more shoot biomass, above ground biomass. That's why they help to drive yield. But if you look at, numerous studies all highlight this, that when you feed plants organic forms of nitrogen, such as amino acids, this has much more of a stimulatory effect on the root biomass. It encourages root hair formation, encourages root length, root biomass. So the organic forms definitely encourage a lot more of the rooting traits of plants. So with that in mind, I would argue that you could say that autumn is particularly for winter crops, autumn sown crops, that autumn is a particularly important time because you really want to establish a good root system early on. That's going to be key in those first few weeks of establishment. You really want, the key thing you want is rooting, especially as you're going to move into, say here in the UK, into a nice dormant winter time. So you want to get things off to a good start before that dormancy. So I would say that autumn is a particularly good time. Right. But then moving on the other side of that, once the crops start growing, plants start growing, or the season temperatures warm up and things get going, sure, as plants grow and develop, they're also going to have a demand for nitrogen, for protein synthesis and that kind of thing as well. So then in-season applications are also very relevant to boost some of those kind of processes, particularly a bit later on for protein synthesis and that kind of thing as well.
Okay. And your clients worldwide, have they reduced their nitrogen a lot by 20-30% or anything like that? Or
Yeah, I'd say that's a pretty common-ish number, somewhere in that ballpark, and there are many farmers at various points along that journey achieving more or less than that, but I think that generally this 20 to 30% it seems to be a pretty comfortable mark that most farmers can get to, particularly in a cropping context. Yeah. I think in a pasture and intensive, say, dairy system and pasture grassland systems, I think they can go actually even further. They can more so comfortably hit a 50-odd%. But these things depend. It is case-by-case scenario. Yeah. But yes, there is that opportunity, and that's the reason that this is possible. It opens up these important discussions again about the difference between inorganic nitrogen and organic nitrogen. And the problem also with some of our inorganic nitrogen forms is that they are very, very reactive in the soil, meaning that they become very leaky. So it's the nitrates that are very leachable. Yeah. Those nitrates under waterlogged conditions can form nitrous oxides, which can off-gas. And then we also have ammonia that can also off-gas. So in the inorganic form, which are the common forms of fertilizers that we use, they are highly prone to losses. 50-odd% nitrogen use efficiencies would be generally considered decent average. So there's a lot there that we're potentially losing. And that's the efficiency gain. That's how we can reduce our nitrogen inputs, is by reclaiming some of that, reducing the losses and reclaiming that. And when you reduce the losses, then you can use less. And that's where some of the organic forms come into the discussion, is because when they are applied to soils and plants, they are a lot more stable because they are organic, because they have carbon attached to them. They're not so reactive, they're not so leaky, they're much more stable forms. So they are better able to synchronize the supply and the demand. When the plant has high demand, the organic forms offer a slow release mechanism, because they're more stable, to deliver that. Whereas when we manage inorganic nitrogen, we typically put large amounts on up front when we have very small plants with very small demand, and we put high supply. And it is this mismatch of supply and demand that creates the opportunity for those losses. Yeah. So that's the real gain of some of these organic forms, is that the carbon-based nitrogen forms are much more stable and therefore reduce the losses, and therefore we can be more efficient and use less and cut down the inorganics.
And I know some work's going on at the moment looking at nitrogen compared to inorganic and organic, but from your experience and travelling around, is there sort of 2-3-fold a better usage of organic against synthetic?
Yeah, this is a good question, and it taps into a little bit of this discussion around what's called nitrogen metabolism, and a process called metabolic shortcutting. And so what that refers to is when plants take up some of these different forms of nitrogen, the plant will expend energy to convert those into proteins and other organic molecules, chlorophyll, DNA, all sorts of other things. And so no matter what form of nitrogen is taken up, it enters this pathway. And the pathway is essentially like a bridge, stepping stones along a pathway. So the further back some of those forms of nitrogen are, the more steps they need to take to get to that protein. That creates a bigger drain or drag of energy. Each step it drains metabolic energy for the plant. And so that's the inorganic forms that have a long way to get to the protein. When we deliver the organic forms that are already well and truly halfway up that pathway, it's just a very small journey to finish the job. And so that drains less energy. And that energy that is therefore saved can be put into more growth processes. So that can be used to produce more tillers, fill more grain, grow a bigger root system, produce more biomass per unit of nitrogen. And that's the efficiency gain that comes with these. And just as an example, there's a neat study on wheat that they applied 15 kilos of actual nitrogen in the form of urea, and they compared that to 1 kilo of actual nitrogen in the form of amino acids. And the yield and production of those two wheat treatments were basically the same. They were on par. So we have 15 kilos of actual nitrogen versus 1. And the reason, the mechanism of how that is possible is that because those amino acids have a small step to finish the job compared to multiple steps, there's a lot of energy saved there, and therefore we have compensatory growth opportunities for greater biomass per unit of nitrogen.
So it's giving it a big kickstart, really.
It absolutely does. Yeah, that's right, for sure.
Okay.
So, yep, there's a lot of benefits and gains for plant growth, that's for sure.
Okay. One last question, Joel. If a farmer was starting from scratch and wanted to get into a system where he increases his biological and microbial activity in the soil, where's the best place to start?
These days, it's great to see we have these discussions around the soil health principles or regenerative principles. And I think that those are, now there's 5 sets of ideas, there are 5 sets of practices in that one suggestion, but as an umbrella, as an overall strategy of saying, well, how do I start this process? How do I begin improving my soils? I think that the reason that those soil health principles have become so popular and ubiquitous all around the world in all sorts of different countries and different contexts, everyone's talking about these universal principles, and I think that that's their real strength, is that they offer an overall big picture view of soil health and how to improve it, management strategies on how to improve it. Now, sure, the context in which how we apply those principles, exactly how we do them in different contexts differs, but the overall messaging is, look, as best as you can follow these 5 principles of minimizing disturbance, keeping that soil covered, living roots, livestock integration, and more diversity, the more you can do this, the better you will see those improvements. So I think that as a foundational starting point, I would absolutely always recommend farmers to generally follow those soil health principles. But I think underneath that, another then part of the answer is, for sure, if you want to increase the soil biology, the number one thing to do is grow a plant. Because when you have plants growing in soil, plants are the ones that are the masters of taking out carbon from the air and fixing that into sugars and sending that down to feed that soil biology. So I think in terms of that, that's a good embodiment of that living roots soil health principle, because when you have a plants are pumping carbon down into the soil, and that's what's feeding that soil biology and driving the changes in soil biology. And when we feed that soil biology, they can improve the chemical nutrient cycling, and they can improve the aggregation, the physical structure of the soil. So definitely, I think as much as possible, as best as we can, think about keeping that soil covered with green plants,
cover crops, etc.
Cover crops, exactly right, spot on, and or a perennial phase where relevant. And of course, grassland farmers have a natural advantage here already compared to arable farmers, because they do embody that principle much more so. But I think and that's why we see in perennial-based systems and grassland systems, generally you do find a lot higher soil organic matter, often considered an important indicator of soil health. You do find a lot more higher soil carbon in pastures than you do cropping. So, and I think that's a good testament to that, is because by default, the pasture-based systems are better following that soil health principle of keeping that soil covered with living roots. So I do think keeping green plants covered is over that soil is absolutely really a really central piece of that kind of puzzle as well. And then I think, beyond that, there's probably all sorts of other things we could say. We touched on a little bit earlier, using maybe some organic amendments and conditioners, maybe some biofertilizers or inoculants, putting kind of stimulants and biology back in to kind of help to kickstart that. I think there's a place for that in a lot of contexts as well, and in certain contexts. So I think the use of some of those kind of materials can be useful to help kind of kickstart the system and get it kind of fired up. And then, of course, it has to be a part of this discussion, has to be, well, how about we also try and back off the things that are doing damage? So let's try and reduce some of the negatives. We want to minimize like we say, we want to minimize disturbance. That means generally minimize cultivations and soil disturbance, but we could also say we want to minimize some of our chemical disturbances as well. So as best as we can, we want to try and minimize the use of some of the pesticides and things, using them only when absolutely necessary, because those can have detrimental effects on the biology, which then has that spin-off negative effects on the chemistry and the physics of the soil. So trying to do less of the baddies and trying to do more of the goodies.